Chapter 3, Mishnah 6. The last Mishnah of this chapter discusses various Tumah laws that apply to saliva, and will teach a dispute about the Tumah status of the saliva of a Tevul Yom. As we have learned, in order for food to be available to become tameh, it must first come into contact with one of the 7 liquids: water, wine, bee honey, olive oil, dew, milk, or blood. This is known as hechsher, preparation for tumah. Saliva is considered like water in this respect. Thus, if food is touched by saliva, it becomes prepared to become tameh. Another rule that applies to hechsher is that a liquid comes into contact with food only prepares it for tumah if the owner of the food is pleased with the presence of the liquid. Because of this, saliva will not always prepare food for tumah. The Mishnah discusses 3 different cases and teaches the law for each case. And we now turn to the words of the Mishnah. 1. If a tahor person was chewing some dry food, thereby mixing the food with his saliva, and some of the chewed food fell out of his mouth into his clothing, as well as onto a loaf of turma, the turma loaf remains tahor, that is, the saliva mixed with the food does not prepare the loaf to be able to become tameh, should it later be touched by a source of tumah. Since the person is certainly not happy with the saliva falling onto the loaf, for it soiled not only the loaf but also his clothes at the same time, he is not considered to be pleased with the presence of the liquid, therefore cannot affect hechsher. 2. If he was eating cracked olives or moist dates, which are fresh, moist foods, or any other fruit with a pit, whose pit he wants to suck the juices from, and some of the chewed food fell out of his mouth onto his clothing as well onto a loaf of turma, the loaf is tameh, that is, it is now prepared to become tameh if it is later touched by a source of tumah. Although the person is surely not pleased with the saliva within the food that has fallen onto the loaf and the clothing, he was pleased with the saliva when it came into being in his mouth, for it was created by his eating the juicy foods or sucking on the pit which he wanted to do. Therefore, the saliva has the ability to prepare the loaf for tumah. 3. If he was eating dried olives or dried dates, or any fruit with a pit whose pit he did not intend to suck any juice from, and some of the chewed food fell out of his mouth onto his clothing, as well as onto a loaf of turma, the loaf is tahor, that is, it is not prepared to become tameh. One who eats dried fruit does not intend to suck the pits, because they do not contain any moisture. Therefore, the person is not considered to be pleased with the saliva that collects in his mouth in such a case. And since he is not pleased with it falling out of his mouth either, since it fell onto his clothing, it cannot affect hechsher. The law that liquids prepare foods for tumah only if the owner of the food is pleased with their presence applied only to liquids that are tahor. Liquids that are tameh affect hechsher even if the owner was not pleased with their presence. Furthermore, liquids that are tameh will not only prepare the food for tumah, but actually render the food tameh as a sheni, since tameh liquids have the status of a rishon. Therefore, the laws taught above would not apply if the person eating the foods was tameh, for his saliva would prepare the loaf for tumah in all 3 cases. The Mishnah now cites a dispute about what the law would be if the person eating the foods was Tevul Yom. Both the saliva of a tahor person and the saliva of a Tevul Yom share these laws. According to this Tana, the saliva of a Tevul Yom is not considered tameh at all, even as the shlishi. Therefore, even the saliva of a Tevul Yom will affect hechsher only if the owner was pleased with it, as in the second of the 3 cases cited above. But Rebbe Meir says, in contrast to a tahor person, all 3 of these cases are tameh only when it comes to the saliva of the Tevul Yom. For the bodily fluids such as saliva of a tameh person affect hechsher whether the owner is pleased with their effects or existence, or if he is not pleased. A Tevul Yom too is considered a tameh person with respect to this law, and his saliva will always affect hechsher no matter the circumstances. But the sages said in response, the Tevul Yom is not considered tameh in this respect, and his saliva, like that of a tahor person, can affect hechsher only if he was pleased with its existence.